Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm Costain, the chief editor of 8.9.com. This is the second programme in our series, Filling the Funding Gap, which is going to run on the Farmgate channel over the next few months. Throughout the series, we'll discuss how natural capital markets work and whether they can help farmers to bridge the gap between public payments and the real costs of agroecological production. In this programme, we'll ask, what do I need to do first to access nature payments? I'm joined by Guy Thallon, Head of Natural Environment at Castle Howard, by David Wright, the founder and Chief Executive of Ecometric, and by Holly Story, the Head of Nature-Based Solutions at National Parks Partnerships. We're going to be talking about what can be measured and how, options for payments, actions that can be stacked with food and fibre production, as well as baselining and outcome measures. Guy, Castle Howard has recently, so I'm just going to go back on that slightly, as well as baselining and outcome measures. Welcome all. Guy, Castle Howard has recently announced a 30-year, 440-acre programme of land management, and you're expecting to sell nature credits through the emerging voluntary biodiversity market. Where did that plan come from, and how did the project get off the ground?
Yeah, thanks, Finlo. I think from our perspective, the Bog Habitat Bank, which we've kind of established, really was first identified in about 2016 as a kind of block of land that could be suitable for nature restoration. But it's only been in the last few years, really, that it's been a project that we've been kind of actively working on, and we've kind of been able to identify the funding streams and starting to kind of turn that from a kind of an idea and ambition into a reality. The first kind of steps of that journey really were to undertake a natural capital accounting assessment, working with colleagues at Science. So we're up in North Yorkshire, Science just down the road from us. And that was a project that was part funded by the Howardian Hills National Landscape and took kind of a view across the entirety of the estate. So the Castle Howard estate is a single kind of block of land and extends over 9,000 acres. And the scientists at Fera used a series of kind of remote sensing technologies, really high resolution satellite imagery, to create a very kind of detailed assessment of the natural capital, but limited in the kind of scale that they could do it. So in kind of getting that full picture view of the whole estate, obviously that can be done across that area using remote sensing, but it doesn't necessarily get to the detail of what's happening on an individual parcel by parcel basis. Through that,
Guy, just to break in, how long did that take, and was it an expensive process to go through?
yeah, so I think it was did have a cost to it. So I think it cost us kind of in the region of £20,000, but we did get funding kind of to support us with that. And it did take a few months to kind of pull that project together and to deliver that assessment. But it was massively valuable. It's given us kind of a bird's eye view across the whole estate, and given us that sense of what the kind of land bank is now, what those parcels are now, and what opportunities that we have to kind of move those around at a landscape scale and kind of reset where we're looking. And that's really where we're at now, is starting to kind of have those clear blocks of land and know what we're going to be using those for the next kind of 30, 40, 50 years. And really the decisions that have been made in the last few years are very much kind of like a change of generation kind of since the kind of farming expanded post war, farming expanded, and then we're now kind of starting to look at actually what's the best use for the land and how do we drive that forwards.
And I guess it may be difficult for you to answer this question, but do you get a sense that that £20,000 that you spent would scale down if you only had 1,000 acres? Would it come down to 2,000? I'm guessing that it wouldn't, that there is a sort of an upfront cost that needs to be there in the first place. Do you have a sense of that? And also, are you able to share where you got that funding from?
Yeah, so the funding was from the Howardian Hills, so National Landscape. So that was farming in protected landscape funding at the time. And in terms of scaling, I think absolutely it would scale down. So the main costs there would have been getting the actual data. So this was commercial satellite imagery data, which has a resolution of about 20 centimeters. So it allows you to get into the detail of where kind of parcels end and where the next one carries on. And then obviously the digitization alongside that and kind of capturing, going around the boundaries and starting to kind of work on that is defined by scale as well. So yeah, once we had that work undertaken, we were then able to identify the different blocks of land, and that's really where the Bog Habitat Bank was identified, and we got the boundary for that area, and we've been able to start kind of looking at options, and that's where we then engaged with Environment Bank, and we've begun the process of setting that site up to be selling nature shares into the voluntary market.
And at that sort of resolution, 20 centimeters, you can count the cowpats, can't you? That's really quite remarkable. I'm not sure whether you actually used the word baselining, but it's obviously something people talk about a lot in terms of natural capital. Can you just talk us through that process of baselining and give us a bit of a definition around it and how what sort of things you were measuring specifically at Castle Howard?
Yeah, so we're in the process of baselining right now. So we started that baselining that you could almost take that natural capital assessment as the first baseline. What are those habitats? Where are they? But now we're in that detail of the red line boundary for the Bog Habitat Bank, and we're starting to undertake that baselining activity. And baselining is a really kind of important part of the process. It's a kind of fundamental component, and ultimately it has to mean the kind of accurate recording and measurement of the habitat types that are extant, measurement of the quality of those habitats and the species that are present, and that has to be undertaken by kind of trained professionals. And then I think an extensive and documented and pretty open program of data capture as well to start kind of building up that rich picture of what is extant, what is there currently, and then how that builds forwards. And that's really important because ultimately this entire market is based on gain, on improvement of natural capital. And if you don't know where you're starting, then you're unable to kind of quantify the gain that builds off the back of that across and building that going forwards.
And presumably, we're at the start, really, of natural capital markets sort of growing in the UK. And so, if you're starting a process of baselining, then you do well to include as many different factors, as many different outcomes as you can within that, even if you're only thinking about selling in particular areas at the moment, because it may well be that that baselining is useful to sell into a different market 5 years or 10 years down the line.
Yes, and I think that's important when it comes to thinking about what kind of natural capital components you're selling. So biodiversity is clearly one that's established through biodiversity net gain, and the voluntary market is emergent. But alongside that biodiversity uplift, you're also sequestering carbon, so there's carbon value there. You may be holding more water, so that ties into kind of markets that are associated with kind of water and flooding, things like that as well. So yeah, I think trying to get a comprehensive picture from the outset is very important, and using remote sensing and in situ monitoring, and also some of the kind of eco tech that's coming along is important as well. And from our side at Castle Howard, when we're trying to sell into that voluntary market and establish that platform and establish those nature shares and working with Environment Bank to do that, I think we're really focused on making sure we have a product that is really high integrity. Therefore, we have to have really high quality data to underpin and support that.
Holly, I'm interested in the thought process around natural capital. What should farmers be thinking about before they start narrowing down those potential markets, and where might they find that information? Obviously, you work with national parks, so perhaps we could start there.
Yeah, I think that's the other side of the coin to what Guy's talking about, really. Is one thing's understanding your land and what potential there is there for enhancement, and the other thing is understanding where the markets might be and what potential there might be to generate income from those ecosystem services that you're delivering. Obviously, if you're in a protected landscape, it's a great resource to have. Guy's already spoken about the Farming and Protected Landscapes funding that might be available. But there's also increasingly quite a lot of expertise within those National Park Authority teams, for example, the same at the National Landscapes. And you'll probably find that even if they can't answer the question within their own team, they'll know someone who can, and they work very closely with us at National Parks Partnerships. So, I definitely say use that resource. Also keep a lookout for events locally. There's quite a number of different bodies running events, not just within the protected landscape. So likes of CLA and then a few and others are running quite a lot of webinars or in-person events on these types of topics at the moment. Podcasts, of course, good way of finding out new information about what markets might be coming along. And because some of them are quite regionally specific, but others are more national in scale. So it might be that there's kind of local initiatives to you that could be quite of interest, but not necessarily having that profile at a national level as well. So yeah, do a bit of digging, I'd say, and then have a think about what fits for your particular context and aligns really well with your long-term plan for your land or your business or your family, because as we've already alluded to, these are really long-term projects. So it's not just about thinking about what fits today, but also what's going to fit as Guy said, in kind of 40 or 50 years' time. You'd need to be thinking on those long-term horizons and financially as well on those long-term horizons. Is it going to really stack up? Do you have the skills and experience to deliver them? All those kind of questions. It's a business decision, really. And I think, if you treat it like one and interrogate it in that way, then that's a good place to start. I wouldn't say, I think sometimes people think of it in terms of another scheme, another agri-environment opportunity, and it's very different to that. So it's important to put it more in the box of another enterprise or another business opportunity.
The impression I get from what you're saying is that farmers shouldn't be trying to stick a square peg into a round hole. That it's about really trying to understand where they are as businesses, what they want to do with their farms more broadly, rather than saying, "Oh, I've heard of that market. Let's have a go at that market." It's trying to think, "This is what I want to do with my land more broadly, and could I benefit by tapping into a market that's relevant, rather than just seeing a market and going for it." And I guess that brings us back to the whole way that on this podcast we've tended to talk about land management in terms of farming for food and fibre, that rather than deciding that you want to be a sheep farmer and then doing it regardless of the landscape that you live in, that you look at the land and you decide what's appropriate for that land so that you can get the best out of that landscape, as well as producing the best food and fibre that you can. That it's a similar sort of approach. It's what can my farm do, and then thinking about whether there are markets that can support that.
Yeah, definitely. And also thinking about the broader landscape that you're in as well. Are there opportunities to connect with a bigger collaborative project, or even just looking at things like your local nature recovery strategies and other things like that are starting to come through, which can help you see actually not just what you're doing on your farm, but how it fits with that bigger picture, because sometimes that can help when you're starting to look at potential for private finance.
You've mentioned farming in protected landscapes, national landscapes, and the national parks. Obviously, you're working with national parks partnerships. What about farmers that don't live in those protected landscapes? What sort of process do they need to go through? And I wonder, when you mention collaboration, whether that's a way of helping to access funding, particularly outside of national parks, that might not otherwise be available.
Yeah, I think it can definitely help you to achieve that scale that some of the private funders are looking for. Also, working with other land managers can help you with kind of getting over that hurdle to entering markets sometimes. So things like accessing, high quality advice, spreading costs in the early stages of a project, and managing some of that risk between you all as well. I think all of those things can be managed quite helpfully when you're working together in a group. Obviously, it does come with some other different types of risks and burdens as well. But it can be a model that suits particularly smaller holdings quite well if you don't have that scale to act as an individual. Some of the national parks do help to facilitate groups like that, but they exist all over the country. You might already have come across them through the facilitation fund that was DEFRA funded, or more recently through things like the landscape recovery projects or the natural environment investment readiness fund, which is a bit of a mouthful, but people often, you might have heard them refer to NERF for short. They're kind of publicly funded programs that are intended to help people kind of look at collaborative opportunities and look at the opportunities through nature markets and private investment.
David, Ecometric is a business that, there was a bit of feedback there, I'm just going to start again. David, Ecometric is a business that assesses and sells carbon, but your approach to land planning could just as well apply to a range of other natural capital markets, from water management to habitat creation, I think. So could you talk us through your approach from satellite data to on-the-ground verification?
Thank you for including me in this, Finlo. I match exactly what Guy and Holly have said about the need to gather accurate data. It starts and ends with how accurately you can sample the environment that you are trying to quantify within, because ultimately the buyers are going to decide whether that is accurate enough. So we're seeing quite a lot of companies pop up into this space that are trying to generate short-term processes and income that we see as pretty mismatched against this as a long-term rebalancing of, if you like, the short-term finance opportunities within a farm business and its long-term sustainability aims. That's what those two things we're trying to draw together. So start and ends with the quality of the input data, and we must remember that these quantification and qualification schemes are all involve sampling. You can't count every beetle over a site. You can't measure the soil organic carbon by taking the whole 30 centimetres of soil and sending it all to a laboratory. So how you sample to gather a representative full spectrum of the values across a site is absolutely vital. And we've got to really start speaking quite loudly about the science, because there's a huge amount of marketing spin going on at the moment, and presentation-y companies sounding like they are science-based when really it's all about kind of commoditizing natural parts of habitats and selling them on without any long-term aim. So the way you sample is one of the ways to see through that, because as soon as you question a company, how have you designed your sampling plan to capture the full variability within that landscape, you can very quickly see whether they're committed to doing it properly. So it doesn't really matter what it is you're trying to quantify or qualify.
Yeah, I've got to break in on that, David. How can they tell? What is it that the companies are doing or not doing that will tell farmers whether they're talking to credible people?
I mean, ironically, the cost of the service is one of the ways. So these too good to be true systems that are pretty much free at the point of entry and promise to pay you for filling out a form, you can be assured that they're not doing any sampling, because you just couldn't afford to run it like that. So that's probably the easiest way. And if you take soil carbon, for example, we know from 5 years worth of very detailed soil analysis, direct soil analysis, and I'll come on to talk about the remote elements of it as well, that it varies hugely in space. So you walk, 10 centimeters away from where you've just taken one sample, and you'll get a different value. So if you're only taking one sample in a group of fields, well, depending on where you position that sample, if you're going to extrapolate that over a large area, you're going to get a value which is wildly different from the true value. So you have to take enough samples to capture the variability. That has a cost to it. So cost will very quickly identify those that are doing it well. And frankly, if it looks too good to be true, you can be sure it is. And so the second part of it is the commitment. So what accountability is there once you've entered the scheme? So if it's free and there's no long-term commitment, again, it's not balancing this need to make genuine systemic change to move us towards biodiversity improvement and climate change mitigation.
And you mentioned earlier on about a lot of the farmers that you're talking to, or maybe a lot is pushing it, but certainly some of the farmers that you're talking to being mismatched with the process. What is it that you've come across? What makes you think that some farmers are mismatched to the carbon market?
Farmers are under enormous cash flow pressure in any given growing season. So if you're trying to introduce a new way of doing things and expecting it to be adopted wholesale quickly, when it might clash with culture, experience, equipment, the way that farming system is set up, then you're misguided, because they're going to make long-term business decisions that are going to impact their immediate cash flow. So if you take this year, for example, farms are under enormous pressure from tax squeezes to environmental change to weather events. In the Midlands, we've had 2.5 times the 20-year average rainfall over winter 23-24, and this winter started in a similar way. So the whole system is trying to keep food on the table while adapting to maintain the business strategy over the next 10 to 20 years to future generations. So those two things can be in tension. And of course, there are companies who will quickly spot an opportunity to set up and provide a little bit of infill cash flow to solve that short-term problem. And that's why we've all got to be very careful to make sure that that company's intentions will stay with the farm for the long term to match that environmental sustainability strategy.
David, you talked about the difference between companies that are doing proper in-field sampling, as well as matching that with the satellite data, and those that aren't. Just to give farmers a sense of a robust company process, I suppose. How many samples would you expect in the average acre or hectare?
So to zoom out beyond that, you have to be taking some soil samples in every field. So, we all know those field sizes grow quite rapidly, and it's certainly in some of the large arable areas. And at the moment, even DEFRA itself for SFI is not requiring that to happen, because there's a very broad definition of what a parcel of land is. So straight away, we need to be sampling every field. And in our opinion, you've got to subdivide that field and take multiple samples. Now, the degree to which you sample, so the size of the stratum or the grid, depends on underlying field shape, variability, historic management, slope, topography, hydrology. So it's not quite as straightforward as to say we're just going to apply a 1 hectare grid. So there's some intelligence needs to be brought to the sampling too. But it's a good start to get 1 sample per field.
Yeah. Okay. And just finally, before I move back to Holly, I wonder, you know, I talked about the way in which your process is very much sort of centered around carbon at the moment, but I suggested that the satellite data approach with on-the-ground verification would work with other aspects of natural capital markets. I wonder, you know, without putting you on the spot too much, whether there are different elements of natural capital markets that you're looking at that you think might fit alongside the process that you have.
So firstly, although we're focusing on soil carbon, we're relating it to very detailed farm management data and the whole carbon footprint. So we are calculating the amount emitted in the production cycle and the amount sequestered. That's very important because we must make sure that any carbon sold is for genuine climate positive gains, because it's the farmer's first responsibility to hit net zero before they trade. And in terms of how the techniques work, we gather a lot of spectral samples from satellite imagery on top of the physical soil samples, and then we're leveraging computer science to relate those two things. So if you think about how to get a sample-based system to be as accurate as possible, to get as close to the true answer, it's all about the number of samples you take. If you're trying to estimate the average income in a city, you've got to take enough samples to cover the whole cross-section, and that's going to have a geographical element to it as well. It's exactly the same in the natural world, if not worse, because we've got almost infinite variability. So what the satellite imagery allows you to do is, in our case, we get 100 spectral samples every hectare to overlay to the number of soil samples we've got. And because the computer system can draw a relationship between the two, you've now dramatically increased the size of the sample data set on which you're going to base your quantification. That exact same system exists in other quantification systems. So if you take, for example, the ratings agencies, which have filled the space, the gap in trust between buyers and sellers, they have embraced this combination of remote sensing and proximal measurements to replace, for example, allometric models in forestry, which traditionally were done by measuring the circumference of a tree at chest height, a certain number of trees into the forest, and then extrapolating those results over sometimes very large areas. The ratings agencies will often put drones with LiDAR, so that's taking a remote measurement to add to those allometric measurements and tighten up the quantification. So it's all about trying to get as close to the true answer as you can.
Fantastic. Now, Holly, the BNG market is something which is accessible to all farmers in England specifically, obviously not the rest of the UK at the moment. I wonder if you have a broad understanding of the biodiversity net gain market, and I just wonder, what do farmers need to do to access BNG markets?
Yeah, biodiversity net gain is an interesting one because there's the national compliance market in England. But it is regionally variable. So it's worth doing some investigation before you embark on a project as to actually what the demand is in your area, and how the local planning authority is dealing with BNG in your particular region. If you do decide to go for it, the first thing, as we've already said, is getting those baseline habitat surveys done and making sure that they're of the right spec for that particular market. I think also to have a look and do have a look at a bit of wider due diligence around the site as well. There are other things that could be going on that might affect your ability to deliver a BNG project. So, for example, checking who owns mines and minerals rights, sporting rights, whether there's any other rights over the land, easements, wayleaves, those types of things. Sometimes that might not have a major impact, but other times it can do. So it's just worth doing those extra bits of checks and balances around it. What are your own kind of management responsibilities over the land, and how long do you have that control for, etc. I think the other thing to have a look at then is also what you want to do with it, and that might be that you have a very strong idea of that already, or it might be that you look to others for their advice and recommendations on that, or look at regional strategies like the local nature recovery strategies that are coming through. And once you've got that clear idea of what action you want to take and what habitats you want to restore or create, you can then look at the biodiversity metric, as it's called. So that's a tool that DEFRA have created to effectively quantify what the gain in biodiversity would be on that piece of land if you undertook a given set of interventions to enhance or create habitat. It's usually best to get an ecologist to do the formal calculation for you, but the metric is publicly available. So if you do want to go and find it, you can kind of have a bit of a play around with it yourself to get an idea of what different types of projects would generate in terms of biodiversity units. There are a few kind of then more formal pieces of documentation that you'd need to have in place before going to the market. So one of those, for example, would be a habitat management and monitoring plan. You'd need to have a kind of legal agreement to secure the land for that 30-year period, which is the minimum for a BNG project. So that can either be a Section 106 agreement with your local authority, or this new legal instrument that we've got that's come in called the Conservation Covenant, which is with a responsible body, which may be the local authority or it might be somebody else. And then obviously you need to find a buyer. And you can look at kind of doing that process in a few different ways depending on your exact situation. But you could, for example, already have been approached by a developer, or you might even have that development site on your own land, in which case you can be quite confident that you know that demand's there for your units. And you might even be tailoring your project specifically for what they need. Or on the other hand, you might be creating a habitat bank, as Guy was alluding to, where you actually set up the project and establish the habitat prior to then going on and selling any units at a later date. And there's pros and cons to different ones, so it's worth getting a bit of advice as to what might suit you best, really. So it's quite an in-depth process. It is quite regulated with it being a compliance market, but in some ways that's a good thing because you can kind of work through it step by step.
In terms of my understanding at the moment, Holly, I wondered just briefly if you could comment that there seem to be sort of clusters where farmers are better able to access the BNG market, where the BNG market seems to exist in England. Presumably, this is going to exist in every county going forward.
Yes, to some extent. I'd say it's difficult. So, for example, if you look within national parks, there are obviously some amazing opportunities for habitat enhancement, but there's pretty limited development. And so some of the demand within that planning authority area, because national parks are planning authorities, will be dictated by what attitude the neighbouring planning authorities take to trading across those planning authority boundaries. That it is allowed. You can trade across those planning authority boundaries or even at a national scale. But there are various kind of checks and what we call like negative multipliers within the system, which mean that for developers, they're incentivized to source within at least the same planning authority if they can. So that there are potentially some obstacles to trading at that national level or at more of a regional level. So yeah, it might be dependent on where you are and what development's going on within your authority area.
Thanks. Holly, just to let you know, I'm going to skip your next question, which is just the what do you think, because we've already touched on it briefly and just from a time perspective. So I'm just going to go into you, Guy, which is, thanks, Holly. Guy, do you think that farmers should take, thanks, Holly. Guy, we touched on this slightly already, but do you think that farmers should take a land first or a market first approach to natural capital sales and delivery?
Yeah, I don't think it could be anything other than a land-based decision, really. And I think some of the challenges that we've had with farming over the last kind of 30, 40 years are probably where the farms have been short-term in their kind of rotation, their thinking, and responsive to markets. So yeah, it needs to be thinking about the land and the capacity of the land. Ultimately, we're talking about natural capital, and the natural capital opportunity is fundamentally kind of defined by the underpinning natural capital. So it's defined by the soil that you have there, the water that you have there, the plants that you have there, all of those kind of natural features. And you can't change some of those components. If you have a kind of field which is predominantly sandy soil, like a beach sand soil, that's not going to be able to turn into a bog. You're not going to kind of magically be able to transform these components. So it really is kind of land first, and the farmer is the person best set to make that kind of assessment, really. So a good farmer should understand the land that they're farming, understand the capacity or suitability of that land for different uses. So the kind of the way that they've been planning and thinking at this time of year in the winter, looking at kind of what the rotation is and where maybe they're looking for SFI and how that fits in. This should be one of those components that feeds into that decision-making process, really. And within there, I think using that kind of knowledge and that understanding of the land to define kind of logical boundaries for change. So think about which blocks are most suited. I do think the kind of difference between kind of land and market is kind of more complicated at a national scale, especially in the context of kind of what Holly's talked about when it comes to BNG and the kind of differences across regions. But I think when you're looking then at a national scale, thinking about land and what the kind of capacity of land is, then you can start to think about, oh, we've got this big block of fen over to the east. What is the best use for all of that land collectively together? And it's that kind of that food versus nature debate is more relevant. But on a farm scale, where you are limited to the natural capital you have within your redline boundary, it's about what the capacity of that is. And then farms are businesses. They are commercial businesses, and they do make decisions. And I think David touched on this a little bit. That are in the best interest for their business, both in terms of if the price is right. So if it is kind of more commercially appealing to move into the natural capital market over cropping and struggling to farm in a changing climate on a rough bit of land as per the kind of bog pool habitat bank. But they are also businesses that are kind of tied into the system that they're operating, and they can be slow to change, and they're loaded with debt. And actually, some of that changing could ultimately come down to when there's a natural change in that system that kind of enables that move into a natural capital market.
David, you presumably meet farmers fairly regularly. What are their main questions and concerns? You're on mute, David.
So first and foremost, the farmers are maintaining a responsibility to grow food and fibre. So that guides their decisions. So they're asking us, well, how do we manage food production with carbon production? What practice combinations are going to maximise our food productivity and sequester carbon? And that's the fascinating part of the data set we're gathering, because it's got a short multi-temporal repeat. We're gathering data every year. And we're doing a lot of work to then relate the change to the practice combination. So there's a great deal of value in that knowledge share of what's working agronomically to produce food. So, for example, regen as a system, we've seen lots of anecdotal claims which are not backed up by science. And there are huge risks waiting in the wings. You know, a farmer that just goes and buys a direct drill and thinks they can convert immediately when their soil's in poor health, poor structure, is going to fall foul, and they'll have a crash in yields. Whereas if that conversion is managed very well, that J curve can be bottomed out fairly quickly, and you can start climbing up the other side. So it's the proving which practice combinations work better than others, and we've got clear data to show that. They want to, so when you break that down, they want to know, well, what's the relationship between my inputs, my yield, and my carbon footprint? And of course, those are intricately linked, and they all root back to the soil. So the soil links food security, climate change, and biodiversity. You know, it's the base of the biodiversity pyramid, if you like. Lots of the regen farmers that are successfully sequestering and monetizing carbon have stopped using insecticide as a great example. So they've got more diverse soil, they've got a lot more insect life. They're working on the fact that beneficial insects will stop the pests becoming dominant, so they don't need insecticide, and the whole system benefits. So we're becoming increasingly interested about, well, how can these other co-benefits be quantified to layer the monetizable value in the farmed landscape? So not talking about the biodiversity in the beyond the field boundaries. What are we doing within the field boundaries? And then they very quickly. So 2 years ago, the conversation was all about how does your technology work? And we'd have to spend ages trying to explain AI, which is a handful. Now the conversation has moved. I rarely get asked about that. They want to know how the carbon markets work. So just the sort of questions you've been asking, what's a good quality system? Everyone says they're high integrity. Sadly, that high integrity phrase has just become a marketing buzzword and is virtually meaningless now. So they ask very specifically, what does high integrity mean? And excuse me, they ask very specifically, what does high integrity mean? And high integrity, in my mind, means that the science has been peer reviewed and not just self-proclaimed expertise. You have to be part of a system, so part of a governing body and registry that's independent to yourself, so that again you're working to a set of rules that are independently checked. The data has to be transparently and immutably recorded. So we don't want any of these opaque systems where buyers can't look and see what data supports the claim. And we all have to remember ultimately that the buyers set the rules. You can do a lot of hard work and then fall foul of a buy-side audit right at the last minute that says, well, I'm sorry, I don't trust what your verifier has said. That doesn't meet our quality requirement, and they don't trade.
David, I'm thinking about the average farmer here, and Guy, obviously at Castle Howard, he's starting from a 9,000 acre farm in the first place. Do you think that these markets, from carbon to other natural capital services, are easily accessible to the average farmer with perhaps 150, 300 acres of land?
In soil carbon terms, sadly, they're too easy to access because we've had a proliferation of carbon trading platforms, for want of a better description, that have few responsibilities, few costs. You get in and you take some cash off the table each year. To enter into a proper, well-measured, well-governed, transparent, long-term market is a bit more difficult. But companies like Ecometric, we're taking an aggregated project approach to this to solve that exact problem. So we can take a farm of any size on, and what we do is we create an aggregated project. They all sit under this umbrella. And the reason we're primarily doing that every farm is separately identifiable, so we have to check that their outcomes are measurable and all the data is gathered at individual farm scale, but the credits can be pooled and sold to large buyers, because we're wanting to sell to buyers that are buying 100,000 tons of carbon plus. So if the system allows that pooling of credits, then it doesn't disadvantage small farmers. And if the price is proportionate to the size of the project, that doesn't disadvantage them. There is a slight mismatch here in the audit governance system. So verification is becoming increasingly expensive. And it appears to be because the verifiers have spotted that there is a global shortage of verifiers. And it's a gate you have to go through. So they're imposing huge prices. So we've been quoted, believe it or not, up to £24,000 per project for a verification, regardless of the size of that project. So they're trying to impose that price on 100 hectares or 1 million hectares to be the same cost. So we're working very hard on behalf of the farmers. So we unusually don't take any cut of the carbon trade. We're there to provide the quantification and project development service. So we work on the farmer's behalf to minimise costs and maximise sale price.
And presumably, when you're talking about the way that you're aggregating different farms into those sort of single sales units, if you've got farmers that are working together collaboratively across a landscape, then that would be another way of dealing with it as well. Thanks, David. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back. And I'll be asking Holly about options for stacking nature services with food production. I'll be talking to David about how farmers should prepare to make first contact with a natural capital investor. I'll ask Guy what other farmers can learn from his experience at Castle Howard. We're having a little bit of trouble with your sound, David, and I just wonder, it's just a little bit muffled, and I wonder if there's any way of improving that at all. Do you have a headset?
We'll try.
Do you have a headset that you're able to plug in or anything like that?
I haven't, but I'll reset stuff and then see if that improves.
Okay, just let me know as soon as you are reset, and I'll crack back in. Does anybody have to go on the dot at past?
No.
Holly?
No, 12 o'clock is mine.
Okay. I suspect we may go over 5 or 10 minutes. I might drop 1 or 2 questions in the second half because we've got through a lot in the first, which is great. And as with many things, the first half is usually the first 60%.
Is that any better, Finlay?
Time will tell, but if you've done that, then that's great. Excuse me. Okay. Welcome back. Guy, what have you learned from your work at Castle Howard that you think would help other farmers and land stewards as they start looking towards the natural capital market?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's yeah, definitely have gone back to school. It's been a fairly continuous process of learning, really, every day. And I think that's a reflection of how kind of new this area, how nascent the market is, and how it's just kind of continuously developing. And as you start to look at natural capital, well, I guess there's the kind of the nice learnings of as you start to kind of look at the natural capital in detail, you get those kind of the kind of piquing your interest in terms of the kind of habitats that you have and the little niche pockets that you can kind of build on, which is always really satisfying to get that better understanding of the land. But then on the kind of other side, I think actually the kind of process and learning about that process and starting to kind of work forwards has been one that is definitely taken longer than I would have anticipated and has been more complicated, especially when it comes to land. So I think in terms of learnings, I think absolutely recognize that this is something that you're going into for the long term, that it is a commitment that you are making, and a partnership that is long term alongside that. And that builds in with it kind of simple things that quickly become very complicated. So getting a clean title on land that you're going to be putting into a Section 106 or a conservation covenant for 30 plus years is one part, and land is inherently kind of complicated and messy, especially when you're looking back and you're kind of having to kind of do searches and inquiries to kind of surface all of those different wayleaves and easements that Holly kind of mentioned and described really well. And then I think alongside that, then you're also working with a partner for that period, that long term, and you need to kind of be set up to ensure that your business is able to deliver that, and you are kind of committed to a habitat management plan, and that is a new part of your business or potentially a new part of your business which needs to be managed and sustained, and the costs need to be kind of recognized, and you need to be kind of planning that as any other part of your business, really. So yeah, I think that's definitely one of those learnings is how you start to kind of do that kind of short-term understanding the land and then looking forwards to think about actually how are we going to support this over the long term as well.
You said that you'd had to go back to school, metaphorically speaking, and you clearly gained lots of information and knowledge as you've gone along. Do you think that farmers need a lot of specialist knowledge in the first place to gain access to those nature markets, or is it stuff that you can pick up as you go along?
Yeah, I think I think absolutely stuff that you can pick up as you go along. I think there's so many resources out there now, and I think businesses are setting themselves up in a way that kind of allows you to go on that journey with them and to understand. I think in terms of kind of making a decision about whether or not to access a nature market and what nature market is right, I think that absolutely can and should sit with the farmer themselves. So you need to be sufficiently well informed to be able to make that decision. But to actually actively enter a market, you, as a very bare minimum, you're going to need a solicitor to help you draw up those agreements, and you're going to need an ecologist to do that baseline assessment and to do that kind of phase one habitat survey or whatever kind of baseline is required to enable. So there is specialist knowledge that is fundamental to accessing these markets. And I think a lot of those businesses who are operating as kind of brokers or in this market are kind of aware of that, how complicated they are, and the need to kind of to some degree hold the hand of the farmer and engage with the farmer in a way that kind of allows them to understand that complexity and to be reimbursed for some of those costs, and also to start to kind of inform that decision making, really. Again, there are those kind of resources around that help and support you in being informed in that process, really. I think probably the most complicated part of it right now is really determining kind of what model is best for your business, because those commercial providers are all setting themselves up with slightly different models, and it's almost kind of trying to find a mortgage and looking at those different kind of variables that are associated with those models, because it is there's kind of different ways to make different components look more attractive, whether there's kind of the guidance and support that's provided alongside the agreement, whether that's the kind of upfront payments, capital payments for capital infrastructure, or the kind of phasing of the payments over the term. All of these different kind of variables and measures that you've kind of used, you can't necessarily compare them like by like. So you definitely need to kind of to look at those options in detail and start to kind of unpick them as you would like when you're looking at maybe a mortgage for a property or mortgage for land. You're kind of comparing like by like and doing that kind of compare the market type thing, really. And that is complicated. That is where like investing that time into business planning and thinking through how does this work and what's best for the business is absolutely necessary.
I heard a really nice phrase in terms of TV production the other day, that there's always a race between channels to be second. And I think it sounds like, it's very much the same here, that if farmers are able, if they're considering these things, then they do really well to find other people. I mean, whether it's through podcasts and, this sort of knowledge sharing at a national level, or whether it's somebody in their region who's gone before them and actually, dealt with some of these challenges, because at that point they can get the support and talk through these issues, as with TV companies and finding the next best game show. Holly, I want to talk about stacking, because many farmers are getting better at using their land to produce and sell more than one thing at a time. Would you be able to talk us through some of the options for stacking natural capital income streams, by which I mean delivering nature outcomes from land at the same time as continuing to produce food and fibre?
Yeah, so first of all, I think for stacking,
getting lots of feedback, aren't we, on you? It's strange.
Sorry.
That's all right. Do you know what? I wonder if it's worth just very quickly popping out and coming back in again, going out of the Zoom and coming back in again, Holly?
On mine?
Yeah. If you just go out of the meeting and come back in again.
Yeah, I think the feedback's coming through David's mic, because when Holly talked, David flashes up as green. So
okay.
Okay.
It may just be that we just kind of.
If David mutes, I think it should be okay.
Okay, let's try that. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Good.
We'll
okay.
I can try again.
I'll just lead you in, which is by which I mean delivering nature outcomes from land at the same time as continuing to produce food and fibre.
Yeah, so stacking's an interesting one. Often when we hear it referred to, people mean stacking different revenue streams from different nature markets. And that's something that is potentially problematic, because for most projects, for most markets, you'll have to demonstrate something called additionality, which is to say that project would not have taken place under a kind of business as usual scenario. So different markets have different tests for additionality and different levels. You might have heard people refer to kind of a legal test, which is to say that you're not legally obliged to be delivering those actions or that project through any other means, so by planning condition, for example, or financial additionality, which is to do with whether or not the payments that you're receiving are really instrumental in you being able to deliver that project. So you can imagine that if you've already signed an agreement with one buyer and are receiving payment for delivering that project, then if you try then to also sell to a second buyer, they're going to say, hang on a minute, you've already got this legal obligation and payments to be delivering these actions. So that's something to be aware of. And as I say, can be quite specific depending on the markets that you're looking at. In terms of stacking farming with nature markets, again, it varies a little bit, but there are some really good opportunities there. So often you'll find in a biodiversity project, for example, that you can still keep some component of grazing in there, although it might be that that's quite different to what you're used to, depending on what your current system is, because it's likely to be really focused on using grazing as a tool to deliver conservation aims. But if you're already in quite an extensive regenerative type system, then that might not be too different to what you're currently doing. I think the other thing to think about if you're looking at carbon, for example, is that there's potentially some other opportunities coming down the track that will be more compatible with farming alongside. So in the past, when we've looked at particularly the voluntary carbon markets, you're looking at predominantly woodland projects, woodland creation to generate carbon credits. And that is definitely a hard land use change. Whereas if you look at the kind of soil carbon opportunities that David's been talking about, or other carbon codes coming through around hedgerow management or agroforestry, they're much more compatible with a kind of multifunctional land use situation. So yeah, it's worth keeping an eye on some of those other carbon codes that are in development. And again, it comes back to that question of is what you're proposing to do by way of a nature project or a natural capital project compatible with your farm business? And are you able to manage both in a way that's really mutually beneficial over a long-term horizon?
And I guess it comes back to that whole thing about really thinking about what you're doing before you enter into those markets. And I'm really interested by the way that you framed that answer around stacking, that it can be difficult to stack one type of nature market on top of another, on top of another. But if you were, for example, to bundle a whole range of different nature outcomes together, biodiversity and carbon, and then within that bundle, make that as part of a single financial arrangement, presumably that's one way of doing it, where that whole bundle is worth more than simply selling one aspect versus another. But then it's about trying to stack different enterprises at the same time, so you can stack natural capital sales alongside livestock production, alongside potentially renewable energy production within a similar holding area.
Yeah, it's there are definitely opportunities there. For example, as you said, you could look to actually bundle your biodiversity benefits or your water quality or flood mitigation benefits with a carbon product. So rather than necessarily selling those to separate buyers or into different markets, you could effectively be selling what at its heart is still a carbon credit, but adding value to that by demonstrating and evidencing all the other what we call co-benefits that are going on alongside that carbon sequestration that you're delivering. And there's some examples of that in the market already. You could have a look at Wilder Carbon, for example, and what they're doing. And definitely in terms of the interaction with the kind of farm business and different enterprises, there's some people doing some really interesting stuff with adding value to particularly livestock enterprises, I think, but also on the arable side by demonstrating the environmental benefit that they're delivering through the way that they're managing their farm business as well. So they can be very complementary. It just takes a little bit of planning and maybe a bit of vision in there as well.
And I'm also interested in the idea of maintenance payments. This is something that's been talked about for quite a long time, but actually seems to be starting to take place now, where water companies are paying farmers on an acreage basis for maintaining their land in a particular way, for not putting particular fertilizers, for example, on that land in order to reduce the amount of nutrient runoff that's taking place. So as we move forwards, we're likely to see an increase in this sort of maintenance payments marketplace, which is very new at the moment, particularly from water companies and potentially from insurance companies going forward as well. Thanks very much, Holly. That's really interesting. Guy, Castle Howard has decided to focus on nature primarily rather than food production, although you do still plan to have a small number of ruminants on the land. Why was that decision taken?
Yeah, so that's true for the Boghall Habitat Bank, which is a kind of dedicated area, but that's 440 acres of the 9,000 acres of the estate. So it's kind of 5% of the total estate footprint. We still very much have an arable business, and we're kind of driving that forwards, transitioning that to regenerative farming, and then looking at the kind of parkland areas across. So in terms of kind of our land use framework and thinking about kind of land use strategy, that is a whole estate perspective and crossing that across. I think on the kind of nature versus food production, I think, yeah, it's such a binary conversation, and it doesn't need to be. It's so much more complex and nuanced than that. We can't farm without nature, so we do need to find those two do need to work together, and we need to find ways to make them work together. On a kind of smaller farm scale, you could think about if you have land that is not performing, land that is marginal, that could be better suited to be a wildflower meadow, that then situated next to an arable field is going to be providing beneficial insects that will predate on any pests that may be going into your crop. So there is a kind of opportunity for these two to work together in simple examples like that. From our perspective, the land at Boghall, I mean, the name kind of gives it away, but it is boggy, it is heavy clay soils. It's land that was farmed because it could be farmed, and because when we could farm land widely, we were being paid to do that on a per hectare basis under basic payment scheme. So it was logical that land that could be farmed was farmed because it provided a return before you even started farming on a year-by-year basis. So I think from our perspective, we're pretty comfortable with that kind of conversation and that debate and going into that detail and breaking it down into away from the kind of binary one or the other into actually talking about both. If you looked at what that land's been producing, it has been marginal. we have had failed crops on there. We've struggled to establish crops. We've struggled to get those crops off. And most of the crops that have been grown on there, yes, they've been for food production, but they've been for alcohol production. So it's kind of like then into our food system, what do we want to be producing in terms of food? What's good and healthy for society? So yeah, I think it's really good to be talking about where our food comes from and how food can be kind of produced alongside nature and how these things can work together and improved alongside each other.
Holly, Guy talked there about the way in which public funding is such an important lever in terms of changes at a national level in terms of legislation have led to changes partly in terms of what they're doing on the farm. I'm sure they were thinking about this anyway, but that's sort of been the final driver that's taken place. So let's talk a little bit more about public funding. How important is that, and what are the range of options for those living inside or indeed outside protected landscapes?
Public funding is hugely important. I think the reality is that for the vast majority of farmers today, the main way that they can get rewarded for environmental land management is through public funding. And although we all want to see these private funding opportunities coming through and being compatible with public funding and being useful to farm businesses, I think we have to be realistic about the opportunities that are there now and the scale that they exist at and the demand that is coming, because even if we look at the voluntary carbon market, which is probably our best developed nature market currently, it's not as strong as we'd like it to be. It's still growing, and I think hopefully in another 5-10 years time that will be a different picture. But in the shorter term, people do still need to be looking at those public funding options, and we have to be honest about that. Having said that, I do think one thing that we will see developing very rapidly is this blended finance approach where you have a mix of public and private funding. So that's already happening. If you look, for example, at woodland creation, you can use your England Woodland Creation offer or whatever replaces that in the next couple of years, alongside looking at carbon finance, and the same goes for peatland restoration. And those grants and the carbon codes are structured in such a way that you can use both, provided you meet certain thresholds that are clearly set out by the carbon codes. In other areas, you can also look to use public funding to help you with your kind of project development and with some of the costs of baselining and other things that we've talked about. So Guy's already mentioned using the Farming and Protected Landscape Scheme to help with some of the costs of establishing their habitat baseline and gathering other data. So that's a really good opportunity that's existed over the past few years for protected landscapes. Unfortunately, it is coming to an end, but we hope there might be something else that comes along to replace it. And in other areas, opportunities through landscape recovery, through NERF that we've already mentioned, can be really helpful in just kind of getting your foot on the ladder and getting the process underway, with things like your baselining, but also if you're working as a group, setting up what you are as a legal entity, getting you advice from other professionals, getting you ecology surveys done and different things as well. So there's some good opportunities for public and private to align, definitely.
And we're just going to have these final few questions. And if you can try and keep answers, people, to about 60 seconds at most on each of these, it's just a kind of a final wrap-up summary, really highlighting the most important points. We're coming towards the end of the programme, and I want to just pose the title question to each of you, if I may. So, David, in summary, what do you think farmers should do first if they're considering selling natural capital services?
They need to think about their farming system. So in soil carbon terms, we've got very clear data to suggest that the conventional high input, high output, deep inversion cultivation system is causing a continued decline in soil carbon stocks. So if that's your system, you need to convert to a minimized till, minimizing the bare soil, maximizing organic matter input. And then also you've got to understand the legal implications of land tenure or ownership. So if you're not an owner-occupier, there needs to be a legal agreement between yourself and the landlord on the rights and responsibilities to the claimed carbon or natural capital payments.
Fantastic. Holly, what do you think?
For me, I think the priority has to be working out.
Can you just start the sentence again? It didn't quite pick up the first bit.
For me, I think the first thing you have to do is look at what your long-term vision and plan is, and then which markets align best with that over the long term. And the second thing I'd say is talk to your park, talk to your neighbours, talk to your farm cluster groups, look for those opportunities for collaboration, because there can be a lot of benefits in that.
And Guy, just finally, what do you think farmers should? Sorry, it's not quite finally. And Guy, what do you think farmers should do first?
Yeah, I think firstly, the priority is really to understand your land. And understanding your land means different things to different people. From some people's perspective, it could be a high-tech approach, measuring every measurable and kind of taking that science-based approach. For others, it could be spending time walking out and about across that land, or spending time with those who've worked or known that land kind of for their working lives and know those kind of wet patches or ponds or hedges that have been removed or lost from the landscape as well. And then, I mean, from there onwards, it's really a case of sitting down, doing some business planning, thinking about your existing enterprise, your existing system, how that's going to perform, especially how that's going to perform in more extreme kind of years, extreme climate, extreme weather events. Look at areas that are marginal, considering alternative uses for those areas. And then also recognizing the synergies that can exist between kind of nature and food production and kind of looking to exploit those. And then from a kind of traditional diversification, what would a more nature-friendly farm offer in terms of other opportunities that could open up? So really an expansive business planning exercise. And then from there, it's researching who to work with. And as any kind of farm decision, that's one that's going to be a combination of head, business numbers, and heart. Who can you work with? Who can you have those long-term relationships with?
Fantastic. Guy, you don't need to answer again. That was great. I'm going to do your question again. And then David, I'm going to come into your question. Okay. So, and Guy, what would your priorities be? What do you think farmers need to do first? And David, just finally, if a farmer has managed to identify an opportunity to sell into the natural capital market, how do they actually go about making that sale? What do they need to do? And we've talked about it already, but just finally, how do they know who they can trust?
So it comes down to the accuracy of the data that's gathered to quantify what you're selling.
I'm sorry, to interrupt you. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to skip that last bit about who they can trust because we've already talked about it. So, and David, just finally, if a farmer has managed to identify an opportunity to sell into the natural capital market, how do they actually go about making that sale? What do they need to do?
So it depends on the quality of the data they have gathered to quantify the natural capital they're selling. And then they need to enter into an accredited, ideally globally recognized scheme that will take them all the way through the governance and audit process to meet buyer requirements.
Brilliant. I was expecting you to go on for slightly longer then. Maybe you could just carry on and just say a little bit how they can find companies that do have those sort of global associations, global verifications.
So farming groups is a very good way to find. So talking to your neighbours. Interestingly, we've done no sales or marketing formally. It's all been farmers talking over the fence. That fence is now digital, and we've got projects all over the world that have come from customer advocacy in the UK. So joining farming collectives, looking at webinars, reading in the press, you should have an awareness about which way the carbon market is moving, and a real recognition that this is about a long-term commitment to a system that is going to preserve carbon stocks, because you're going to be required to meet the permanence requirements that follow the sale. This isn't a short-term arrangement, it's a long-term commitment to change.
Thanks so much. That's been so interesting, but that is all we have time for. This was the second programme in our Filling the Funding Gap series, and in the next episode we'll ask, how do I measure and sell carbon? For now, I'd like to thank my guests, Holly Story from National Parks Partnership, David Wright from Ecometric, and Guy Thallon from Castle Howard. Farmgate's Filling the Funding Gap series is sponsored by Barclays, Environment Bank, Forest Carbon, Howden Insurance, Regenerate and Safri. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us and share our links. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo and individual donors. I've been Finlo Costain. Bye for now. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. Sorry, it's a bit messy at the end, but it'll all come together.